In 216 BCE, on a flat plain in southern Italy, the greatest army Rome had ever assembled walked into the most perfectly executed trap in military history. 80,000 Romans, destroyed in a single afternoon. The man who did it commanded an army of Gauls, Spaniards, and Africans, people Rome considered barely civilized. His name was Hannibal, and he did it again and again. For 15 years he roamed the Italian peninsula, and Rome, the most disciplined military culture the ancient world had ever produced, could not stop him. 3 centuries later, in a forest in Germania, 3 full Roman legions, 20,000 men, were swallowed by trees and rain and the fury of tribes Rome had already conquered. No formation saved them, no discipline held. The man who destroyed them had been trained by Rome itself. He knew every trick. And still the legions died. The question is not how Rome lost those battles. Armies lose battles. The question is what those defeats reveal about everything Rome got right. The system so total, so precise, so deeply embedded in the bodies and minds of ordinary men that when it worked, nothing on earth could match it. And when it failed, there was nothing left underneath. He was not a soldier when he arrived. He was a problem. The youngest son of a farmer who had nothing left to divide, a young man with no land, no trade, and no particular future. He had grown up poor in the way that most of the empire grew up poor. Not starving, but close enough to feel it in lean years, close enough to know that one bad harvest could take everything his family had spent a generation scraping together. He was the surplus of an agricultural world, and the legion was waiting for him. For most of Rome's early history, the army had been the domain of men who owned land. The logic was straightforward. A man with property had something worth defending. He would fight well because he was fighting for his own. The poorest citizens, the capite censi, those counted only by their heads because they had nothing else worth counting, were kept out. They were not trusted with the business of empire. That changed. Around 107 BCE, the general Gaius Marius opened the legions to the landless. He was fighting a grinding war in North Africa and needed men. The Senate had given him the right to conscript, but Marius took volunteers instead, men who had nothing to go back to, nothing to lose, and everything to gain from a steady wage, a full belly, and the promise of land when it was all over. Rome never fully closed that door again. The army that would conquer the known world was built, at its core, from men the old republic had not thought worth arming. By the imperial period, the recruiting picture had grown wider and stranger than Marius could have imagined. Legions no longer drew primarily from Italy. They pulled from Spain, Gaul, the Balkans, Syria, North Africa, wherever Rome had planted itself deep enough to produce free-born citizens. A recruit arriving at the gates of a fort on the Rhine might have grown up speaking a language that had no Latin in it at all. The empire had outgrown its original manpower base, and the army had simply expanded its appetite. Whatever his origin, a man who wished to enlist had first to prove he was freeborn and a citizen. This was not a formality. Slaves who tried to volunteer faced execution if discovered. The army was particular about the legal architecture of its soldiers, even as it grew less particular about nearly everything else. A letter of recommendation from a veteran or a local official helped. Without one, the road to enlistment was slower, the scrutiny harder, and the welcome cooler. Once a man presented himself, he stood before a recruiting board and underwent the probatio, a formal examination that was part physical inspection, part legal inquiry, part something closer to a cold appraisal of livestock. Officers looked at his face and eyes, the breadth of his chest, the build of his limbs. They were reading a body for potential. A minimum height was required, somewhere around 172 centimeters for a standard legionary, in taller still for the first cohort and the cavalry. A man who fell short was turned away, regardless of his willingness. They also checked his eyes. A man with poor sight was no use in a formation that required reading the movement of shields and standards in smoke and chaos. Cataracts, significant injuries, missing digits, all were grounds for rejection. There are records of men who cut off their own fingers to avoid service, and records of emperors who sold such men into slavery for doing so. The army knew what it needed, and it was precise about it. If the physical examination was passed, the recruit's legal status was confirmed, his distinguishing marks noted, and his name entered into the rolls of the probatii, those approved for training. He was not yet a soldier. He was a candidate. Note, the army had accepted his body as promising raw material, nothing more. The work of making him useful had not yet begun. He was then handed 3 gold coins, the viaticum, a travel allowance that sent him on his way to wherever his assigned unit was stationed. 3 coins to cross a province. The sum was generous by the standards of what he had known, but the journey was long, and by the time most recruits arrived at their unit, the coins were largely gone. The veterans who escorted them on the road had ways of helping with that. When he finally reached the fort, he did not walk in as a soldier. He entered as a tiro, a raw recruit, and was kept apart from the regular soldiers during the initial months. He slept separately, trained separately, ate with others like him. The army was not sentimental about the transition. It had seen 10,000 men walk through that gate before him, and it was not yet convinced he would be worth the investment. At some point during this probationary period, he received his signaculum, a small lead tablet inscribed with his name and unit, kept in a leather pouch worn around his neck. The same material was used to mark slaves and to stamp goods at market. The Romans were not troubled by the comparison. A man who had not yet taken the oath occupied a strange legal position, no longer fully a civilian, not yet a soldier, his body tagged and catalogued like any other asset of the state. The oath itself, the sacramentum, was the hinge on which his old life closed. He swore to execute faithfully all that the emperor commanded, never to desert the service, and not to seek to avoid death for the Roman state. Yet these were not ceremonial words. The sacramentum rendered the swearer sacer, given to the gods, in the most literal religious sense. To violate it was not merely a military crime, it was an act of impiety against the divine order that underpinned Roman civilization. The oath put his life on deposit with Rome, and Rome intended to collect. What the army had recruited underneath all the legal procedure and physical inspection was a young man with no compelling alternative. The farms that had once sustained families like his had been swallowed by large estates worked by slaves. The spoils of conquest circling back to hollow out the very population that conquest required. The legion offered what the land no longer could: food, shelter, wages, structure, and at the end of 25 years, a piece of ground to call his own. He did not enlist for Rome. He enlisted for himself. The army was counting on exactly that. The recruits who passed through the probatio came from different provinces, different languages, different gods, different ways of eating and sleeping and marking time. They had nothing in common except what the army was about to give them. That was the point. The legion did not want men with deep roots and strong prior loyalties. It wanted blank slates, young men not yet grown into fixed identities, whose sense of who they were could be taken apart and rebuilt to specification. In the early days of the Republic, those specifications had included owning land, having a stake in the outcome, being the kind of man whose loss would be felt by a community. By the imperial period, the specification had been reduced to its essentials: freeborn, a sound of body, legally a citizen, and willing. The rest would be manufactured. That was what the training was for. He stood at the gate of the fort with his 3 coins mostly spent and his name on a list. He did not know what was coming. Nothing in his life had prepared him for it. Not the poverty, not the hard seasons, not the physical labor of a farmer's household. The legion had recruited a man shaped by want and circumstance, and it was about to take him apart with something far more deliberate. The first thing they took was his walk, Before a tiro touched a weapon, before he learned to hold a shield or throw a pilum, he spent weeks learning how to move, not walking as he understood it, the unhurried, uneven gait of a farm or a village, but marching in step with other men at a precise cadence, covering 20 Roman miles in 5 hours under the summer sun, with a full pack on his back. The army understood something his previous life had never taught him, that a man who could not move with others was not a soldier. He was just a body in the way. The pack weighed close to 40 kilograms once everything was included: armor, weapons, entrenching tools, rations, a cooking pot, stakes for the camp palisade. He carried it every day, up hills, through rivers, across rough ground. The marches were not a test. They were the training itself. His legs thickened, his back straightened, and then hardened. His lungs expanded to meet demands they had never previously faced. The farm boy who arrived thin and uncertain began, month by month, to occupy a different body. Swimming came next if the fort sat near water, a river, a lake, the sea. Every tiro was made to swim. It was not a leisure activity. Armies crossed rivers, bridges washed out, men fell from boats. A soldier who drowned in a crossing was a waste of everything the army had already put into him, and the Roman army was not in the business of waste. He stripped, entered the water, and learned. There was no discussion of whether he wanted to. When the weapons training finally came, it began with wood and wicker. The practice sword was twice the weight of a real gladius. The practice shield was twice the weight of a real scutum. This was deliberate. The idea was simple and brutal. A man who had spent months fighting with something heavier than the real thing would find the actual weapon almost effortless when he finally held it. So the body would carry the memory of the heavier load and translate it into speed and control. He trained against a wooden post 6 feet high, striking it morning and afternoon, learning cuts and thrusts through repetition so intensive that the motions eventually required no thought at all. The post was not an accident of method. It had a specific purpose beyond building strength. Striking a post rather than a man meant that the recruit could rehearse killing movements in isolation, learning exactly where to aim, exactly how to drive the blade, without the instinctive hesitation that came from facing a human opponent. The army understood that most men did not kill naturally. Killing had to be manufactured. The post was where that manufacturing began. And the gladius itself was a weapon unlike anything the tiro had encountered in civilian life. It was short, around 50 to 60 centimeters of blade, and the Roman military had made a deliberate choice about how to use it. Other armies slashed, Romans stabbed. The reasoning was cold and precise. A slashing blow required a wide arc, exposed the arm and shoulder, and was easily seen coming. A thrust required no backswing, kept the body behind the shield, and reached its target before the enemy could react. A wound 2 inches deep in the abdomen was nearly always fatal. It was a doctrine designed not for courage, but for efficiency. The scutum was the weapon's partner. It was large and curved, built to wrap around the left side of the body. And its horizontal grip meant that a soldier's arm hung naturally at his side, rather than straining across his chest to hold it up. In formation, 2 scutums pressed together could deflect a dozen thrusting spears. Against an oncoming line, the legionary was taught to drive forward with the shield first, using its mass and the weight of the man behind it as a battering force, before bringing the gladius into play in the narrow gap that the impact created. The shield was not defensive. It was the first weapon. The pilum came before any of this. 2 of them, carried into battle, both thrown. The pilum was a javelin with an iron shank designed for a single specific purpose. It was not meant to kill, though it sometimes did. It was meant to ruin a shield. If the shank was long enough to punch through a wooden shield and still reach the man behind it, and soft enough to bend on impact so that it could not be thrown back, An enemy whose shield now had a meter of bent iron hanging from it faced a choice: fight encumbered or drop the shield entirely. Either way, the Roman line that hit him 30 seconds later found him diminished. The pilum was the first act of a sequence. The gladius was the close. He also learned to vault onto a horse, not because most legionaries were cavalry, and they were not, but because the army wanted men who could do things that required them to overcome their own limitations. Wooden horses were used at first, then real ones. Recruits who had grown up with horses found this easier. Those who had not found it terrifying and did it anyway. And the requirement was not about cavalry tactics. It was about what happens to a man who is regularly made to do frightening things in a controlled environment. Eventually, the fear diminishes faster than it once did, and the man on the other side of it is more useful than the one who went in. Formation drills followed weapons training, and this was where everything individual became collective. Recruits learned to respond instantly to horn calls and shouted commands: to advance, halt, turn, form testudo, open ranks, close ranks, without pausing to interpret the instruction. The goal was a formation that moved as a single organism. A man who hesitated while reading the command cost the man beside him a gap in the shield wall, and a gap in the shield wall cost lives. And the drill ground was where individual reflexes were subordinated to collective ones, and the army was relentless about the replacement. Soldiers who excelled in weapons training received double rations. Those who failed to meet standards received less. The army used hunger and abundance as instruments of instruction, and in a force drawn largely from men who had known genuine want, the message was felt precisely where it was intended. Competence meant eating well. Incompetence meant eating less. The arithmetic of incentive was designed for the men the army had actually recruited, not for men of some other background. The training did not end. This was the feature that separated the Roman system from nearly every rival it faced. 6 months of initial training produced a tiro who had reached the standard required for assignment to a unit. And the day he arrived in that unit, the training continued. Veterans drilled once a day. Tirones drilled twice. Formation exercises ran on a schedule that did not pause for poor weather. In some postings, covered halls were built specifically so that the work could continue through winter without interruption. A Roman soldier trained for every year of his 25 years of service. The enemy he faced at almost any point in his career had probably trained for far less. Somewhere in those first months, the army also gave him a uniform. Short hair, clean-shaved in the manner the legions had carried since the time of Scipio Africanus. He looked like the men around him, the physical markers of wherever he had come from. The particular way his hair had grown, the regional variation of his clothing. Whatever habits of dress had marked him as a man from one province or another were removed. This was not an incidental detail of grooming. It was the first material step in the manufacture of a collective identity. He could not look different from the men beside him, even if he tried. His name had been entered into the rolls at probatio. Now it appeared on a different kind of document. His unit record, which tracked his service, his pay, his punishments, his commendations, and eventually his discharge. The army bureaucratized him completely. He had a number on a list. He had a unit. He had a set of equipment issued to him on account, the cost of which was deducted from his wages. The farm he had come from probably had no record of his existence beyond the memory of the people who lived there. The army recorded everything. He was, and for the first time in his life, a man fully known by an institution. And the institution had invested heavily in him and intended to keep track of its investment. What the training produced after 6 months of this was a man who moved differently, stood differently, and occupied space differently than the one who had walked in. His body had been rebuilt by specific demands. His instincts had been partially replaced by conditioned responses. He was not yet a soldier in the fullest sense. That would take years of service, real action, the specific education of danger. But he was something the farm or the street corner had not produced. He was the beginning of a product. The legion had started its work. The Josephus, who wrote about the Roman army in the 1st century CE, reached for the phrase that everyone who has studied the legions has reached for since. Their training was bloodless battle, their battles bloody training. The line has been repeated so often that it risks losing its meaning. But it points to something real. When the moment of actual combat arrived, the noise, the press, the terror, the Roman soldier's body had already been through a version of it thousands of times. The fear was still there. It did not go away. But the body knew what to do despite it, because the body had been taught to know, and the army had spent months making absolutely sure. Other armies across the ancient world had brave men. They had strong men. They had men who had grown up fighting and who knew no fear of it. What they almost universally lacked was this: a system that could take any man, timid or bold, strong or merely serviceable, and produce from him a soldier of predictable, reliable capability. The Roman training program was not designed for the exceptional recruit. It was designed to set a floor. Whatever a man came in with, he would leave with the same basic competencies as every other man beside him. The exceptional recruit became formidable. The merely adequate became capable. Even the frightened became functional. That was the design. On the last day of his formal training period, the Tiro, who had passed every stage, the marches, the swimming, the weapons work, the formation drills, was formally mustered into his unit as a miles, a soldier. He received no ceremony worth recording. There was no speech. There was probably a document signed, a notation in a ledger. Then the day's schedule resumed, and the training continued, and he took his place in the ranks, and the machine moved on. 8 men shared a tent. That was the foundation of the entire system. Not a century, not a cohort, not a legion. 8 men sleeping together, eating together, marching together in a leather tent roughly 3 meters square that they erected every evening and struck every morning. The Romans called this unit the contubernium, from the words for together and shelter. It was the smallest cell in the organism of the army, and it was, by design, where a soldier's most durable loyalties would be forged. The 8 men of a contubernium shared everything that could be shared. They took turns cooking from a common ration. They split the labor of pitching the tent and digging the latrine trench. They rotated through guard duty together. One mule carried their collective equipment on the march: the tent, the stakes, the hand mill for grinding grain, the tools. 2 servants attended them, caring for the animal and ensuring water reached them on the road. The contubernium was functionally self-sufficient, a small household embedded inside a military machine designed to make the men inside it feel over time that they depended on each other for everything. That dependence was not accidental. The army understood something about human loyalty that most institutions have to discover the hard way: that men do not fight and endure for abstractions. They fight for the person to their left and the person to their right. They endure for the man who handed them water when they were sick, who covered their watch when they could barely stand, who ate from the same pot and slept close enough that they could hear each other breathe through a cold night in Germania. The contubernium manufactured that person. It gave every soldier, regardless of where he had come from, someone to be loyal to. Rewards and punishments both fell on the contubernium as a unit. If one man stole, all 8 could answer for it. If the group distinguished itself, all 8 received commendation. This collective accountability was not arbitrary cruelty. It was precise social engineering. A soldier who might ignore a threat of personal punishment was unlikely to ignore the knowledge that his failure would bring consequences down on 7 men he had shared a tent with for years. The system used loyalty as a mechanism of discipline, turning the bonds it had manufactured into the very instruments by which it maintained order. 10 contubernia formed a century. Nominally 100 men, In practice, 80 soldiers and around 20 officers and support staff. The century had its own standard, carried by a junior officer called the signifer. It had its own horn player, the tubasin, whose calls translated orders into sound across the noise of a camp or a battlefield. The men of a century knew each other's names, histories, and capabilities in the way that comes only from sustained proximity. They had marched the same roads, built the same camps, dug the same ditches together. The century was not just an administrative unit, it was a community. At the head of that community stood the centurion. He was not a general's man, not a politician's appointment, not an officer drawn from a class that had been educated for command from birth. In most cases, he was a soldier who had come up through the ranks and distinguished himself enough to be elevated above them. He knew the life because he had lived it. He knew what the men were capable of because he had been one of them. That shared origin gave him an authority over the century that no commission from above could manufacture, not the authority of rank alone, but the authority of a man who had already proved, by the standard the men themselves recognized, that he deserved to lead. The centurion's visible symbol of office was the vitis, a staff of grapevine wood, roughly a meter long, carried in his right hand. It was not decorative. He used it. Some minor infractions, a man slow on parade, a soldier whose equipment was dirty, a legionary who flinched from a task, could be corrected on the spot with the vitis, immediately and without appeal. This was not the whipping reserved for criminals, which carried social stigma. The vitis carried none of that. It was a correction administered by a man the soldier knew, in front of men who all accepted the same standard. A centurion named Lucilius was known to his soldiers as Cedo Alterum. Give me another. Because he broke vine staffs on soldiers' backs so frequently that he needed replacements brought to him. He was one of the first men killed when his troops mutinied. The centurion marched at the front of his century during battle, not at the rear. This was not symbolic courage. It was structural. We're in a formation where the front ranks bore the greatest danger. An officer who fought alongside his men, who took the same ground, absorbed the same risk, bled in the same places, created a specific kind of bond that could not be produced any other way. He was not directing the fight from safety. He was in it. When a century closed with the enemy, every man in it could see exactly where their centurion was and what he was doing. That visibility was part of the system. It held the line in a way that commands from behind never could. The centurion's helmet crest ran transversely, side to side rather than front to back, precisely so that he could be identified from the front rather than only from above or behind. His armor was often more ornate than a standard legionary's, decorated with campaign awards, torques, armbands, the medallions worn on a chest harness. These were not vanity. They were a public record, worn on the body, of everything the centurion had survived and been recognized for. A soldier looking at his centurion in the moments before a battle was looking at a man who had been through worse and was still standing. That information had military value. The centurion was paid roughly 12 times the basic legionary rate. The differential was not only reward, it was a stake. A man who earned 12 times more than his soldiers had 12 times more to lose from demotion. Demotion was possible. The centurionate was a meritocracy in a world that offered few of them. A man could rise through it, from centurion of the 6th cohort to centurion of the 1st, and eventually to the primus pilus, the senior centurion of the entire legion, whose status approached that of the senior officer class. That ladder kept ambition productive. It gave capable men somewhere to climb inside the system, which meant they stayed inside it. 6 centurions commanded a cohort. 10 cohorts formed a legion. The hierarchy was regular and legible. Any soldier knew exactly where every unit stood in relation to every other, what its centurion had achieved, what the cohort had done. Precedence was clear. In a world without the communications infrastructure that modern armies take for granted, that legibility was operationally essential. A general could delegate authority to a cohort commander and trust that the chain of command below him would carry the order correctly down through centurions and decanii to the 8 men in their tents, each of whom knew exactly what was expected and exactly what would happen if it was not delivered. The legionary standard, the aquila, the eagle, sat above all of this. It was carried by the aquilifer, a soldier of particular honor, and its loss was the closest thing the Roman army had to institutional catastrophe. 3 eagles were lost at Teutoburg Forest, and the humiliation of that loss persisted in Roman consciousness for decades, driving campaigns of revenge that were as much about the recovery of those symbols as about military strategy. The eagle was not a piece of metal. It was the embodied identity of the legion. A man fought not only for his contubernium and his century, but, at some remove, perhaps less viscerally, for the thing the eagle represented, the institution that had made him, that had taken his name and entered it in a ledger, that had given him his wages and his kit, and the 8 men who had become, over years, more familiar to him than his own brothers. The army reinforced these loyalties through ritual. The birthday of the legion's eagle was celebrated annually. Imperial festivals were marked with distributions of money and food. The dead were honored. Soldiers who had served well received decorations in public ceremonies. These were not gestures of sentiment. They were the tools of an institution that understood the emotional needs of the men it operated, and that had learned to meet those needs in forms that simultaneously deepened attachment to the system. A soldier who wept at the funeral of a fellow legionary was a soldier more bonded to the century that had shared the loss, and more determined to protect whatever remained. The penalties for defection from this structure were calibrated along the same principle of collective consequence. Desertion brought death, not always immediate, but certain if caught, and the army was patient. A man who abandoned his post dishonored not just himself, but his contubernium, his century, his cohort. The shame traveled down. The men he had slept beside for years bore the stigma of producing a coward. In a system where identity was collective, the worst punishment was not physical. It was exclusion. To be cut off from the belonging the system had spent years manufacturing. The army understood this and used it with precision. In the most extreme cases, as collective punishment took a form that has given modern language one of its words. Decimation, the selection by lot of every 10th man in a disgraced unit for execution by the other 9, was not a common practice. There are only 11 confirmed instances in the historical record. It was used sparingly precisely because overuse would have destroyed the bonds it was meant to protect. But its existence, the knowledge that a unit's collective failure could result in soldiers killing their own tentmates with clubs in front of the assembled army, was a shadow that lay across every formation. A man thinking about breaking was thinking about what that choice might bring down on the 7 men in his tent who had done nothing wrong. The army had engineered that thought deliberately. By the middle years of a soldier's service, 10 years in, is perhaps 15. The contubernium had become something that had no precise civilian equivalent. Not family, not friendship as civilians understood it, but something produced by a combination of shared danger, shared labor, shared confinement, and shared consequence that civilian life almost never created. The men had been hungry together and fed together. They had marched until their feet bled and built camps in the rain and stood watch in the cold and buried men they had known for a decade. Whatever they had been when they arrived, frightened, landless, surplus, they had been replaced by something the system had made on purpose. The centurion who commanded them was the hinge between that small, intimate world and the vast, impersonal machinery of the empire. He stood close enough to the men to know them and be known, and senior enough to the institution to carry its authority into the century's daily life. He was the human face of a system that had no face, the point at which the abstract weight of Rome became a specific man with a vine staff who knew your name and would hit you with it if you were late to parade and stand in front of you when the enemy came. That combination, the intimacy and the authority, the punishment and the presence, was what held the century together. It was not love. It was something more durable than love. It was structure. The architecture of loyalty the legion built was not Rome's most visible achievement. The roads, the aqueducts, the monuments, those were what the empire left behind in stone. But underneath all of it, the system that had made the empire possible was a leather tent, 8 men, 1 mule, and years of proximity so managed and so total that by the time it was over, the men inside it could barely imagine who they had been before it started. Rome did not invent the way it fought. It borrowed. The first military system Rome used belonged to someone else entirely. Lifted from the Greeks by way of the Etruscans, the powerful civilization that had dominated central Italy for centuries before Rome outgrew them. The phalanx arrived in Rome not as a conquest trophy, but as a practical solution to a practical problem. Rome had neighbors who fought in phalanxes, and in the wars of the early Republic, a phalanx met with anything less rigidly organized simply rolled through it. Rome looked at what was winning and adopted it without sentiment or hesitation. In a phalanx, soldiers stood 8 ranks deep in a solid block, shields locked, and spears extended. They moved forward together or not at all. The front rank bore the contact, while the ranks behind pressed forward with their combined weight, driving the enemy backwards through mass and momentum. Against other armies standing in open formation, against undisciplined fighters, against anyone who lacked the training to hold their nerve against a wall of bronze and spear points moving toward them in lockstep. It was nearly unstoppable. Rome used it with great success for the better part of 2 centuries, and for most of that time, it had no reason to think about replacing it. The thinking began on the slopes of the Apennine Mountains. Rome's expansion through central Italy brought it into sustained conflict with the Samnites, hill people who did not fight the way Rome expected enemies to fight. They did not stand in the open and wait. They used the terrain. They drew Roman formations into narrow valleys and rocky passes where the phalanx could not maintain its line, and then they struck from angles a locked formation could not cover. The phalanx needed flat, open ground and a cooperative enemy. The Samnites provided neither, and Rome suffered for it repeatedly across 3 wars spanning most of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. The most instructive of the disasters came at a place called the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE. A Roman army of perhaps 20,000 men marched into a mountain pass in Samnium, acting on false intelligence that had been planted by the Samnite commander Gaius Pontius. When they reached the far end of the pass, it was barricaded. When they turned back, the entrance behind them had been sealed. There was no battle. There was no fighting at all. The entire army, consuls, officers, and all, was trapped without supplies between 2 walls of felled timber and massed Samnite troops on the heights above. They were forced to surrender, hand over hostages, and walk, stripped of armor, beneath a yoke of Samnite spears. It was the deepest humiliation the Republic had ever suffered, and it was accomplished not by a superior fighting force, but by terrain and intelligence and a Roman formation that could not adapt to either. Rome remembered the Caudine Forks for centuries. The phrase entered the language as a byword for catastrophic trap. But the more important response was tactical. The phalanx was not abandoned immediately or all at once. Rome's military reforms rarely worked that way. But across the Samnite Wars, where the army developed a new approach to battlefield organization that addressed directly what the mountain passes had exposed. The solution was the maniple. A maniple was a smaller, independent unit of around 120 men. Where the phalanx had been a single, rigid organism, the manipular system divided the army into many smaller organisms that could operate independently of each other. The army arrayed itself in 3 lines of maniples, staggered like a checkerboard, each unit offset from the one in front of it, with gaps between. The gaps were tactical invitations. If the terrain broke the formation, the units did not collapse. They adjusted. If one section came under pressure, units from adjacent positions could shift to reinforce without disrupting the whole line. The 3 lines were not interchangeable. They carried different roles and were filled with men of different experience. The hastati stood at the front, the youngest, least seasoned soldiers, throwing their javelins and making first contact with the enemy. Behind them stood the principes, older veterans who replaced the hastati when the front line tired. And behind the principes, crouching on one knee and waiting, were the triarii, the oldest and most experienced men in the legion, armed with spears in the old fashion, kept in reserve as the final recourse if everything in front of them broke. The Romans had a saying for the worst moments of a battle. It has come to the triarii. It meant that the situation had become genuinely desperate, and the men who had seen the most and endured the most were the only thing left between the army and collapse. The triarii were so rarely called upon that their frustration at waiting through battle after battle occasionally became unmanageable. There are accounts of generals who were forced to put the triarii at the front of a formation simply because the men had threatened to cause trouble if they were made to sit out another engagement. They were described as sometimes resorting to open begging to be allowed into the fight, veterans of decades of service sitting on the ground behind the line like impatient children, while younger men earned the glory they had been promised. The manipular system carried a ranged capability the phalanx had never possessed. The hastati and the principes both carried javelins, the pilum, in addition to their gladius. Before closing with the enemy, a manipular line could loose a volley of iron-headed shafts designed to punch through shields and leave them useless. An enemy force that had previously been able to stand at a safe distance, harassing with projectiles and retreating before the slow phalanx could reach them, now found itself under return fire from nearly every Roman soldier in the field. The battle dynamic shifted. Distance was no longer safe. The checkerboard formation had one other advantage that took time to fully appreciate. It meant that a Roman commander could control individual maniples during a battle, redirecting them, pulling them back, sending them forward, in a way that the phalanx had made impossible. Once a phalanx was committed, it was committed. A general who had launched his wall of spearmen had no real levers left to pull. A general commanding manipular units could respond to what was happening in front of him in something approaching real time. The maniple gave tactical initiative back to the man in command. For almost 2 centuries, the maniple system carried Rome from a regional power to the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. It defeated the Macedonian phalanx at Cynocephali in 197 BCE, a moment that Polybius recorded with something close to wonder. The Macedonian pike phalanx, which had swept from Greece to the borders of India under Alexander, was destroyed in a few hours by the flexibility of a formation that could exploit the gaps a rigid block inevitably left when the terrain broke its alignment. Rome's enemy had not become less brave. The phalanx had simply met something it could not answer. But the maniple, too, had a ceiling. As Rome's wars moved further from Italy, into Spain, into Africa, into the kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, the scale of the engagements changed. Armies grew larger. Opponents were better organized, better resourced, and fighting on ground they knew. The maniple was a precision instrument. Against 30,000 Gauls on an open field, precision was still an advantage. Against a coordinated force of comparable size and experience, the relatively small maniple units could find themselves overwhelmed before reinforcements arrived because the gaps in the checkerboard formation that allowed for flexibility also allowed for penetration. The solution came in the broad sweep of reforms associated with Gaius Marius in the late 2nd century BCE. Though the changes were slower and more gradual than the name of any single general suggests, The maniple was replaced by the cohort as the Army's basic tactical unit. A cohort was roughly 4 times the size of a maniple, around 480 men in 6 centuries, and 10 cohorts formed a legion. The checkerboard subtlety of the 3-line manipular system was replaced by a heavier, more unified formation that could absorb punishment on a scale the maniple could not. Every cohort was identical. This was the crucial departure. The old manipular system had sorted men by age and experience into different units with different weapons and different roles. The hastati and the principes and the triarii had distinct identities and distinct functions, and an army that ran short of one type had no way to compensate with another. And the cohort eliminated the distinction entirely. Every man in every cohort carried the same weapons, wore the same armor, and had been trained to the same standard. A cohort from the 1st Legion and a cohort from the 10th were interchangeable in a way the old maniples had never been, and the whole army could be scaled simply by adding or removing cohorts without disrupting its fundamental organization. The cohort reform also changed how individual soldiers related to the army's logistics. Under the Marian changes, legionaries carried their own equipment, weapons, entrenching tools, rations, cooking gear, on a forked pole over their shoulder. The baggage train that had previously burdened and slowed Roman armies shrank dramatically, and soldiers began calling themselves Marii Muli, Marius's mules, and they wore the name as a point of pride, a force that could sustain itself on the march, that could detach a cohort and send it 30 kilometers in any direction without worrying about whether its supply lines could follow, was a different kind of military instrument than anything Rome's enemies had previously faced. The 10 cohort legion also changed how authority was distributed inside the army. A general commanding 30 maniples needed to be everywhere at once, issuing specific directions to unit commanders who had limited discretion. A general commanding 10 cohorts could delegate entire sections of the battlefield to subordinates with the instruction to use their own judgment. The army became, in a structural sense, and capable of operating in a more decentralized way. A cohort commander could be told to hold a hill, fall back if pressed, and reinforce the line to the left if the opportunity arose, and then left to execute the task without further instruction. That kind of authority given to a subordinate required confident, capable mid-level officers, which is one of the reasons the centurionate became the backbone it did. What the 3 systems share is more revealing than what separates them. The phalanx was adopted because it solved the problem of fighting enemies who already had it. The maniple was developed because the phalanx could not fight in mountains and could not respond to enemies who refused to stand still. The cohort was built because Rome had grown into an empire that needed a professional, standardized, and self-sufficient army capable of operating anywhere on Earth without collapsing into administrative complexity. Each system solved the problem in front of it. None was the permanent answer. The Romans never believed there was a permanent answer. That willingness to look at how a thing was failing and change it without mourning what was lost is harder than it sounds. Most institutions defend their methods longest precisely when those methods have stopped working, because the methods are tied up with identity, with pride, with the careers of men whose status depends on the current way of doing things. Rome discarded its tactical inheritance 3 times in 1,000 years of Western warfare, and each time, the army that emerged was more capable than the one it replaced. The soldiers who filled those formations, frightened farmers, landless young men, the surplus of a growing empire, had almost nothing to do with the decision. But they lived or died by it. The night ended before it felt like it should. The 4th watch had barely given way to the gray before sunrise when the bucina sounded across the camp, a long, curved horn whose call moved through the darkness like a physical thing, reaching into every tent and barrack block in the fort. The men of the contubernium stirred on their straw mattresses. Someone already had the fire going. No one said much. The morning had its own grammar, learned through years of repetition, and it required no commentary. The first task was the kit. Before a soldier ate, before he spoke to anyone who outranked him, he checked his equipment. Armor was inspected for loose fastenings, cracked plates, missing rings. The gladius was pulled from its scabbard and examined. Edge, point, the condition of the grip. The scutum was checked for warped boards or damaged rim. A dirty kit or a loose fastening could earn a fine or a reduction in rations, and the centurion's morning inspection was not a formality. He moved through the barrack block with the unhurried authority of a man who had seen 10,000 excuses and found none of them satisfactory. Breakfast was simple and fast. The men of each contubernium prepared their own food on their own fire, usually from the grain ration they had milled themselves the night before. Flat bread baked on a stone or a thick wheat porridge called pools was what most mornings produced. Hard cheese and olives supplemented it. And the drink was pasca, water cut with vinegar, which tasted sour and thin but kept the gut settled and the body functional through a long morning of work in a way that plain water sometimes did not. The men ate quickly in the company of the 7 men they had slept beside, without ceremony or comfort. By the time the sun was properly up, the day's assignments had been distributed. The Roman army on garrison duty was not waiting for a battle. It was working. Duty rosters covered an enormous range of tasks: guard rotations at the gates, the walls, and the headquarters, fatigue parties for camp maintenance and construction, foraging details, escort assignments, courier runs, latrine duty. Every man had a job. The army had not built a fort to shelter idle soldiers. It had built a fort to house a workforce. And the workforce was expected to earn its accommodation and its wages every day. The training never stopped. Even on a day without a march or a patrol, the morning held weapons drill. Men returned to the post they had trained against as recruits, not because the army thought they had forgotten how to use a sword, but because the army understood that a skill rehearsed 10,000 times was different in kind from a skill rehearsed 500 times. The drills were not about learning. They were about depth, burying the motions so far into muscle and reflex that no amount of fear or noise or confusion could dig them out again. A man who had stabbed a wooden post every morning for 10 years would stab a wooden post when his hands were shaking and his ears were full of screaming. Formation drills ran alongside weapons work. The cohorts moved on the parade ground to horn signals, advancing, halting, wheeling, forming testudo, opening ranks. The testudo, the tortoise formation, required the front rank to lock shields edge to edge in front of them, while the ranks behind raised their scutums overhead and overlapped them into a continuous canopy of wood and iron. It was a maneuver that could stop an arrow volley from above, and it required every man in the formation to know exactly where to position his shield before the signal finished sounding. On a parade ground in peacetime, it was a drill. Under the walls of a city being defended by archers, it was the difference between reaching the gate and not reaching it. Around midday came the main meal, the cena, and it was taken seriously. The men ate together in their contubernium, and the meal was the largest of the day. The grain ration had been milled, mixed, and baked the previous evening by rotation. Smoked bacon or salted pork accompanied it when the supply situation allowed. Lentils, chickpeas, and whatever vegetables the foraging parties had turned up filled the pot. The army ate an enormous quantity of wheat. A soldier required somewhere around 800 grams of grain per day just to sustain the energy demands of his routine. And the army moved mountains of it across the empire to keep the number constant. The cena was not a luxury. It was maintenance. In the early afternoon, the pace of the day slowed slightly. Lighter duties filled the hours. Repairs to equipment, correspondence for those who could write, visits to the bathhouse. The Roman fort's bathhouse was not a pleasure facility. It was part of the system's maintenance of the men's bodies, in the same spirit as the regular marches and the weapons drills. A soldier who bathed regularly, who kept his skin clean and his wounds attended to, was a soldier who stayed functional longer. The army was practical about this. It had invested too much in each man to lose him to a preventable infection. The day's construction work ran through the afternoon in any fort that was still being built or extended. Soldiers were engineers as a matter of institutional requirement, not personal inclination. They built roads, bridges, drainage channels, and fort walls with the same systematic competence they brought to formation drills. The tools were carried as standard equipment: saw, axe, pickaxe, basket, entrenching tool. And the work was done to the Army's specifications, and which were detailed and non-negotiable. A legion that left a fort behind it left behind something that would stand for decades. The quality of the construction was part of the Army's reputation, and the Army was meticulous about its reputation. In the late afternoon, if the day had been a march day, the camp building began. This was the Roman Army's most distinctive daily ritual. At the end of every day's movement, 20 Roman miles on a regulation march, sometimes less, rarely more, the column halted at a site that had been selected and surveyed by the advance party, and every man in the force turned from soldier into laborer. The camp ditch was dug first, 5 feet wide, 3 feet deep, thrown up around a rectangle of ground large enough to house the entire force. The rampart went up from the spoil. The palisade stakes, carried by each soldier on the march, were driven into the crown of the rampart. And then the tents went up inside, in exactly the same arrangement they had occupied the night before, and the night before that, in every camp the Army had ever built. The regularity of the camp layout was not aesthetic. A soldier who had been hit and was staggering back through the chaos of a retreating force could find his tent in the dark, in an unfamiliar camp, in a province he had never been in before, because it was always in the same position relative to the gates and the headquarters. The man beside him in the tent was always the same man. The latrines were always in the same corner. The granary was always near the headquarters. The bathhouse was always near the perimeter. The Army had built a world that did not change. Wherever it went, so that the men inside it never had to spend cognitive effort figuring out where they were. That effort could be spent on the enemy. As the sun fell toward the horizon, the watchword for the night made its rounds. A small wooden tablet, the tessera, was inscribed each evening at the tribune's tent with a single word: the night's password. A designated soldier carried it from tent to tent along the line, each unit's officer signing for it, the tablet moving through the entire camp before dark and returning to the tribune to confirm that the system was intact. The word changed every day. At the gates, at the picket posts, at every station around the perimeter, the challenge required the word, and the word alone would suffice. The night was divided into 4 watches of roughly 3 hours each. Every soldier pulled his share of them across the cycle of a week, and the Army was not sentimental about the rotation. A man assigned the 3rd watch rose at roughly 2 in the morning, stood his post in whatever weather the season provided, and then returned to his mattress for what remained of the night before the bucina sounded again at first light. A sentry found asleep at his post faced the fustuarium, a form of communal beating administered by his own unit, which often proved fatal. No one was found asleep twice. What the daily routine built over months and years was a particular kind of man, not the heroic individual of Roman literature, not the stoic philosopher-soldier who chose virtue over fear, but something more useful and more durable than either. A man whose body had been maintained to a standard, whose skills had been ground in so deep that they operated beneath conscious thought, whose environment was so controlled and so consistent that uncertainty had been almost entirely removed from his daily existence. The routine was not a backdrop to the soldier's life. It was the soldier's life. The institution had designed it that way on purpose. Away from the work and the drills and the watch rotations, the men found their own texture. They gambled. Dice were everywhere in Roman forts, turning up in every corner archaeologists have examined. They drank within limits that the army enforced imperfectly. They wrote letters home or had letters written for them if they could not manage it themselves. They visited the vicus, the civilian settlement that grew up outside almost every permanent fort, where traders, tavern keepers, craftsmen, and families of soldiers created a community around the edges of the military machine. In the vicus, a soldier could buy better food, a cup of something stronger than Pascha, the company of a woman, and a few hours of something that felt like an ordinary human life. The ordinary human life was what the army was always in competition with. The men it recruited had come from that life, the farm, the village, the family table, and the memory of it sat somewhere in all of them, quieter in some than in others, but present. The army's response was not to erase it, but to replace it day by day with a routine so total and so consuming that there was almost no space left in the day for the other life to occupy. A man whose every waking hour was scheduled by the institution, whose food, shelter, purpose, company, and identity were all provided by the same source, was a man who had been slowly separated from any life the institution had not given him. The veterans understood this most clearly because they had had the longest time to watch it happen to themselves. A man 15 years into his service had spent more of his adult life inside the system than outside it. The movements of the daily routine had been written into him so completely that a morning without the buccina felt wrong. A meal eaten alone felt incomplete. A night without a watch rotation felt almost too quiet. He had not lost himself to the machine. He had become it. That was not a tragedy in his understanding. It was the deal he had made, and the army had kept its end. The day ended the way it had begun, with the buccina and with the check of the kit, thus with the same 7 men settling into the same tent. Outside, the night watch moved through the camp. The tessera made its rounds. The word for the night was carried from hand to hand in the darkness. Everything was in its place, as it had been the night before, as it would be the night after. The routine closed around the men like a wall, solid and reliable and utterly without mercy. And they slept inside it and were grateful for it, because they knew by now what the world looked like on the other side. 3 times a year, the army paid its soldiers. January, May, September, the stipendium arrived on a fixed schedule, and on payday, the century assembled, and each man's name was called, and the coins were counted into his hand in front of witnesses. It was a ceremony of accountability, not generosity. The army wanted every soldier to know exactly what he had received, because what he had received was about to become considerably smaller. Under Augustus, a legionary earned 225 denarii per year, 3 payments of 75. By the reign of Domitian, the figure had risen to 300. These numbers sound modest, and measured against the demands of the life they purchased, they were. But measured against what the men who filled the legions had known before enlisting, the marginal existence of a landless laborer, the precarious arithmetic of a small farm, they represented something genuinely better than what most of them had left behind. The army understood this. It had designed the pay scale with the recruit pool in mind. The deductions began immediately. Food came off the top, the grain, oil, and vinegar that made up the daily ration. Each charged to the soldier at a fixed rate whether the quality was good or the quantity sufficient. Equipment followed: armor, weapons, replacement kit, the leather straps and iron fittings that constant use destroyed. Clothing was itemized separately. The tent shared by 8 men was charged to the 8. The mule that carried their collective gear had its fodder billed to the contubernium. By the time all compulsory deductions had been made, a legionary's actual take-home pay could be as little as half of the nominal figure, sometimes less in years when equipment was damaged and needed replacement. The signifer, the standard bearer of the century, served a second function that had nothing to do with the standard. He was the century's banker. Each soldier's account was maintained in the century's records, and held under the signifer's custody, and the balance moved according to deductions, deposits, and disbursements that were documented with a precision the men who owed money on a farm back home had never encountered. The army kept track of every coin. A soldier who died in service left a ledger entry, and his savings, whatever remained, were dispersed according to the will he had been strongly encouraged to lodge with the century's records before any campaign began. Part of each soldier's pay was withheld compulsorily as savings. The army held the money on his behalf in the century's account and returned it at discharge. This was described as being for the soldier's benefit, a nest egg accumulating against the day he left the service. It was also an anchor. A man whose savings existed only inside the Army's accounting system had a powerful financial incentive to remain inside the Army's accounting system. Desertion did not just cost him his career and expose him to execution. It cost him everything he had managed to accumulate over years of service, forfeited to the state the moment he ran. Beyond the regular pay, there were contributions to the burial club, the ad signa, a deduction that guaranteed a soldier a proper funeral should he die on service. This was not a trivial matter. A man without a proper burial faced, in Roman religious understanding, a restless afterlife, wandering without passage. The army's provision of burial rites was a form of religious insurance as much as a financial product, and the soldiers valued it accordingly. And the institution had learned to meet the men's spiritual anxieties with the same systematic efficiency it applied to their physical ones. A further deduction funded the Saturnalicium, the regimental dinner held during the winter festival of Saturnalia, one of the few occasions in the year when normal hierarchy relaxed and officers served their men, and the rigid structure of daily life softened briefly into something approaching celebration. This, too, was compulsory. The army did not ask whether a soldier wished to contribute to the regimental dinner. It deducted the amount and held the feast, and the man who had paid for it sat at the table and was, for a night, part of something that felt communal rather than coercive. The distinction was probably not lost on him. On campaign, the financial picture shifted considerably. Booty was the mechanism by which ordinary soldiers could, in theory, become wealthy. When a city fell or an army was defeated in the field, the spoils, coin, precious metal, weapons, livestock, slaves, were collected and formally divided by the commanding general according to a ranked scale. The general took the largest share. Officers took more than common soldiers. But even the infantry legionary at the bottom of the hierarchy could receive, after a successful campaign, a distribution that dwarfed several months of regular pay. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul made ordinary soldiers rich enough to drive up property prices in the towns they retired to. The promise of plunder was never guaranteed, but it was always present, and it kept men willing to march toward danger in a way that wages alone could not. The donativum sat above all of this, an extraordinary payment made by emperors at moments of political necessity. A new emperor ascending the throne paid the legions. An emperor celebrating a military victory paid the legions. An emperor who felt his position was unstable paid the legions. These bonuses could equal a full year's salary or more, delivered in gold rather than silver, and they arrived without warning and without deduction. By the late imperial period, the donativum had become an instrument of political survival. Emperors who could not or would not pay found their throne contested with startling speed. The soldiers had learned over generations exactly how valuable their loyalty was, and they priced it accordingly. For the first 2 centuries of the empire, soldiers were legally forbidden to marry. Yet a man who had been married when he enlisted found his marriage annulled by the act of enlistment. A man who formed a relationship during service could not make it legal, could not give his children legitimate status, could not make his partner his legal heir. The woman he lived with in the vicus outside the fort was, in the eyes of Roman law, his concubine. His children were illegitimate. They could not inherit through him unless he made specific legal provision, and the law placed obstacles in the way of that as well. The ban was not enforced with perfect rigidity. The army was pragmatic about what it could police and what it could not. But the legal consequences it produced were real and were felt by the men who lived inside them. The purpose of the marriage ban was not cruelty. It was financial and operational control. A soldier with a legal wife had a legal dependent with claims on his estate, his savings, and potentially on the army's resources. A soldier with legitimate children had heirs whose interests might eventually compete with the army's. A soldier whose family obligations were legally recognized was a soldier whose loyalty had been divided by the state's own machinery. The ban removed all of that. It left the soldier, legally speaking, alone in the world, except for the institution that employed him. His savings were held by the institution. His burial was provided by the institution. His identity, his community, his daily structure, all of it came from the institution. There was nowhere else to belong. When Septimius Severus lifted the marriage ban in the late 2nd century CE, the change was less liberating than it appeared. By that point, the army had found other ways to bind men to it. The saving system remained. The deductions remained. The financial dependency that made a man's long-term economic security contingent on completing his service remained. Marriage now added a new layer of attachment. Soldiers who had wives and children living in the vicus outside the fort were men who could not simply walk away without abandoning everyone they had built a life around. The ban had kept men in through legal deprivation. Its removal kept them in through something deeper. The premia, the discharge benefit, waited at the end of 25 years like a horizon that never seemed to get closer. Under Augustus, it was fixed at 3,000 denarii, later rising under Caracalla to 5,000. It was a sum substantial enough to purchase a modest farm, start a small trade, or live on careful investment for many years. But it was only paid at honorable discharge. A man cashiered for cowardice received nothing. A man who deserted received nothing. A man who died on service left his savings in the century's account, disbursed according to his will if he had made one. The premia was a tool of retention as much as a reward. A carrot held precisely far enough out that it remained worth reaching for year after year through cold and danger and the grinding tedium of garrison life. Half of each soldier's pay was held back and credited to his savings account rather than placed in his hand at the pay parade. This was official policy, a compulsory savings mechanism that the army presented as a service and administered as a leash. A man who completed his service walked away with 25 years of accumulated half pay waiting for him in addition to the premia. A man who left early or was thrown out or was killed walked away with far less or nothing. The army made the arithmetic clear. Long service paid, short service or bad service or no service at all paid almost nothing. The men understood this. It was why they stayed. Promotion offered the sharpest escape from the financial tightness of ordinary service. A soldier elevated to principals, the specialist and administrative grades above common legionary, received 1.5 times the standard pay. A soldier raised to the duplicarii received double. Yes, a centurion of the lower cohorts earned roughly 5,000 denarii per year, more than 20 times the basic legionary rate, and the gap continued to widen as rank increased. A primus pilus, the senior centurion of the legion, earned at a level that placed him close to the equestrian class. The path from landless recruit to that elevation was long and hard, and most men never completed it. But the path was real, and the army made sure every man knew it was there. A soldier's financial relationship with the army was, in aggregate, a system designed to ensure that he always needed it more than it needed him. His food, shelter, medical care, and social belonging were all provided by the institution and charged against his wages at rates he had no power to negotiate. His savings were held by the institution and could be forfeited. His retirement was funded by the institution and could be withheld. His legal status as a man forbidden legitimate marriage whose family had no standing in Roman law made the army's community the only community with any formal claim on him. He was not a slave. He was paid, fed, housed, and given a career and a community and a path to something better. He was also, in ways that took years of service to fully appreciate, completely owned. The men who had been recruited from the margins of the empire, the landless, the surplus, the youngest sons with nothing to inherit, had walked in looking for something better than what they had. The army had provided it. Food, shelter, wages, brotherhood, purpose, structure, and the distant but real promise of land or money at the end. What it had not advertised was the price. To the price was 25 years. The price was belonging utterly and completely to an institution that had designed every element of the transaction to ensure that the soldier could not afford to leave before it decided to let him go. On discharge day, when the premia was finally paid and the man walked out of the fort for the last time, he was in his early to mid-40s. He had spent his entire adult life inside the machine. His savings were real. His discharge bonus was real. The land or the business or the quiet farm he could now afford was real. But the life he had known since he was not yet grown into his name, the 8 men in the tent, the bucina at dawn, the weight of the kit, the smell of the camp, that was also real, and it was gone. Most veterans spent the rest of their lives in communities of other veterans, whilst in the colonial towns that clustered around old forts, living beside men who had come out the other side of the same machine and understood, without having to explain it, exactly what had been given and what had been taken. 3 times in Roman history, the machine failed so completely that the failure became a reference point for every military disaster that came after it. Cannae in 216 BCE, Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, Adrianople in 378 CE. Different centuries, different enemies, different terrain. But each collapse shared something that matters more than the tactical details. In every case, what broke was not the courage of the soldiers or the quality of their training. What broke was the system. And when the system went, there was nothing underneath it. Cannae was the most spectacular. In the summer of 216 BCE, Rome assembled the largest army in its history, somewhere between 70 and 80,000 infantry and cavalry, with the stated purpose of finally destroying Hannibal Barca and ending the Carthaginian invasion of Italy that had humiliated Rome at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene the 2 years prior. The army was enormous. It was motivated, and it was commanded by 2 consuls who were constitutionally obligated to alternate command on alternate days. On August 2nd, the command fell to Gaius Terentius Varro, who was determined to fight. Hannibal had fewer men. He had somewhere around 50,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry against Rome's 80,000. And he chose a flat plain near the town of Cannae in Apulia, partly because open flat ground was where Rome's system worked best. The Romans read this as an invitation. When the consuls formed their infantry into an unusually deep and narrow formation, tighter than normal, massed for a single crushing push through the center of the Carthaginian line. The logic was sound by Roman standards. Drive through the middle, break the enemy's cohesion, win. Every instinct the system had trained into the legions pointed in the same direction. Hannibal had anticipated all of it. He placed his weakest troops, Gauls and Spaniards, at the bulging center of his line and his veteran African infantry on the flanks, echeloned back. His cavalry on both wings was stronger than Rome's. As the Roman infantry pushed forward and the Carthaginian center bent backward under the pressure, the Roman soldiers felt exactly what their training had taught them to want: progress. They pressed harder. They closed the gaps between men to maintain the pressure. By the time the African infantry on the flanks wheeled inward, the Roman mass was so compressed that the men at the rear could not reach their weapons. Hannibal's cavalry had meanwhile routed Rome's horsemen and swept around behind the Roman formation to seal the only remaining gap. The encirclement was complete. What happened next lasted most of the afternoon. 70,000 men, trained by the most sophisticated military system in the ancient world, died essentially unable to fight back. Not because they had stopped being soldiers, but because the formation that was supposed to express their capability had become a killing pen. The system required space to function, space to throw the pilum, space to work the gladius, space to maintain the integrity of the shield wall. Nor in the compressed killing ground at Cannae, there was none of it. The training was intact. The discipline was intact. The machine was intact in every part except the one that mattered. It could not operate. Roman losses were somewhere between 50 and 70,000 dead in a single afternoon. News of Cannae reached Rome that evening. Women filled the streets in the darkness, calling out the names of their men. The Senate met in emergency session. A senator threatened to kill any Latin ally who proposed surrender. The treasury was empty within weeks. Rome began levying slaves and criminals to fill the legions. Philip V of Macedon signed an alliance with Carthage. The city's oldest ally in Sicily abandoned her. 15 years of Hannibal in Italy had not broken Rome. One afternoon at Cannae very nearly had. The system had failed, not because Hannibal was braver than the Romans, but because he had understood the system better than the men inside it, and had found the precise geometric conditions under which it destroyed itself. Rome recovered. It always recovered. It abandoned the direct engagement Hannibal craved and ground him down through attrition across 15 years, until Scipio Africanus took the war to North Africa and forced Hannibal home. At Zama, in 202 BCE, the system that Cannae had exposed was improved and redeployed, and Hannibal lost. Rome did not honor Cannae with a monument. It studied it. Cannae became the template, the battle that every Roman commander thereafter carried in the back of his mind as the shape of what could go wrong when an enemy understood your system more completely than you did. The Teutoburg was different from Cannae in almost every measurable way and identical to it in the one that mattered. In September of 9 CE, the governor of Germania, Publius Quinctilius Varus, led 3 full legions out of their summer camp toward their winter quarters on the Rhine. He had been told by Arminius, a Cherushi nobleman who served as a cavalry officer in the Roman auxiliary, that a minor rebellion had broken out to the northwest and that the legions should take a slightly different route to deal with it on the march. Varus trusted him. He had dined with Arminius at the officers' mess. He had received him as a friend. Arminius held Roman citizenship and had trained in the Roman military system. He had been given the rank of eques. There was no reason not to trust him, and that was the trap. Arminius had spent years preparing. He had recruited tribal chieftains across a wide area of Germania, built earthen ramparts along a narrow valley in the Teutoburg Hills, and coordinated a plan to strike a Roman column that would be stretched out across kilometers of forested, waterlogged ground where no legion had ever drilled, and where no formation the army had ever built could function. He had served in the Roman army long enough to know exactly which conditions rendered its strengths useless. The legions were not ambushed by enemies who had beaten them at their own game. They were drawn into terrain specifically selected to ensure they could never play it. The 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, entered the forest in a marching column that stretched for kilometers. The baggage train moved with them, laden with equipment, camp followers, with servants, and the accumulated material of a force transitioning from summer operations to winter quarters. When the attack came, it came from the tree line, from above, from the flanks, from positions the Germans had prepared in advance. The legions could not form ranks. The ground was too broken, the trees too close, the column too strung out. Officers tried to establish defensive positions. Individual centuries fought with everything they had been trained to bring. None of it was enough. The system required a specific set of conditions to function. Every one of those conditions had been removed. The fighting lasted 3 days. Each morning the survivors reorganized and pushed forward. Each night they built a camp and waited for the next attack. By the 4th day, Severus understood that no rescue was coming and that the army had been destroyed. He fell on his sword, as did most of his senior officers. The last of the soldiers fought until they were killed or captured. Those taken alive were enslaved or sacrificed at Germanic religious sites. The 3 eagles, the aquilae of 3 legions, were carried off into the forests as trophies. When the news reached Rome, Augustus is said to have beaten his head against the walls of his palace in the small hours, crying out for Verus to return his legions. The numbers of legions 17, 18, and 19 were never used again. The empire pulled back to the Rhine and never seriously crossed it again. Germanicus led punitive expeditions into the forest years later, burning villages and recovering 2 of the 3 eagles. But the dream of a Roman province east of the Rhine died in the Teutoburg Valley with Verus's 3 legions. The lesson the army drew was the same one Cannae had taught. The system had limits defined by terrain and conditions, and a commander who did not understand those limits was not commanding the system. He was simply walking it into somewhere it could not survive. 3.5 centuries after Teutoburg, on August 9th, 378 CE, the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens led a field army out of Adrianople in Thrace to meet a Gothic force that had been raiding the Balkans for 2 years. His scouts reported the enemy numbered around 10,000. The actual figure was considerably higher, though no one on the Roman side knew it yet. Valens had been in correspondence with his nephew Gratian, the Western Emperor, and who was marching east with reinforcements and had asked Valens to wait. Valens did not wait. Gratian had recently won a victory over the Alemanni on the Rhine, and Valens wanted a victory of his own before his nephew arrived to share in it. He had also been told his enemy was smaller than it was. He marched. The Roman army arrived in front of the Gothic wagon circle in the early afternoon of a hot August day. The men had marched 8 miles under the summer sun. They were thirsty and tired and had not eaten since the morning. The Goths' cavalry was away foraging when the Romans arrived, and Fritigern, the Gothic leader, opened negotiations to buy time for his horsemen to return. While envoys rode between the lines, 2 Roman cavalry units, acting without orders, attacked the Gothic position and were driven back. The unordered attack triggered a general engagement that began before the Roman infantry had finished deploying. The rear column was still arriving at the field when the front of the line was already fighting. The Gothic cavalry returned. They had been foraging to the north and east, and they came back at the gallop to find a Roman army half deployed against their wagon circle and their own infantry already engaged. They struck the Roman right flank, driving the cavalry there from the field and leaving the Roman infantry's right side and rear exposed. The Roman formations, already disordered by the unplanned engagement and the heat and the exhaustion, could not pivot to meet the new threat. The line buckled. Then it broke. Men who had been trained to hold ground under pressure found themselves packed too tightly to use their weapons. They flanked and then encircled in a scene that should have been impossible, given everything the system had spent centuries learning from Cannae. Roughly 2/3 of the Roman army died. Valens died with them. His body was never found. Adrianople produced the same post-mortem the earlier disasters had, a chronicler reaching for the comparison to Cannae, the ancient standard by which all Roman catastrophe was measured. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that since Cannae, there had been no slaughter like it. But Adrianople was not simply Cannae repeated. Cannae had happened to an ascending empire with the manpower and the institutional resilience to absorb the blow and come back stronger. Adrianople happened to an empire that had been thinning for a century, diluting the legions with federate barbarian troops whose loyalty ran to their own chieftains rather than to Rome, stretching the frontier beyond what the shrinking tax base could maintain, replacing the cohort system's trained professionals with cavalry-heavy forces that operated differently and held to different standards. The Gothic cavalry that destroyed Valens's army at Adrianople was partly made up of men who had already been inside the Roman system. The Goths, whom Valens had settled south of the Danube in 376 CE, had agreed to serve as Roman auxiliaries. They had been given land in exchange for military service. When Roman provincial officials mistreated them, starved them, and attempted to disarm them, they revolted, and the revolt drew in Gothic warriors who had never agreed to anything with Rome at all. What fought at Adrianople was partly a force that the Roman system had armed, trained, and then failed to keep. The machine had tried to absorb the Goths and had managed it imperfectly, and the imperfect absorption had produced an enemy that knew Roman tactics from the inside. All three disasters point to the same truth from different angles. The Roman military system was not indestructible. It was durable precisely because it was designed, and designed things fail in predictable ways when their operating conditions are removed. At Cannae, the operating condition removed was space. At Teutoburg, it was terrain and surprise. At Adrianople, it was the institutional coherence that had once bound the army together, the centurions who knew their men, the men who knew their contubernium, the shared training that made a century of soldiers respond to a horn call as a single organism. By 378, fragments of that system remained, but the whole had been diluted past the point where it could hold under pressure. The individual soldiers at Adrianople were not cowards. They were simply men without enough system left to fall back on. Hannibal had known what Rome was. The forest had known what Rome needed. Time had simply taken it apart. The empire that emerged from Adrianople was never quite the same. It recruited Gothic foederati in increasing numbers, ceding tactical command to their own chieftains rather than integrating them into the centurion structure. It relied more heavily on cavalry, which could not build roads, could not construct a fortified camp every night, and could not be maintained for 25 years at the same cost and consistency as the old legionary system. The army that had once been a machine for converting ordinary men into reliable instruments of empire became something harder to define. Powerful in moments, fragile in structure, dependent on the personality of particular commanders rather than the deep-set competence of 10,000 men who all knew exactly what to do because the same institution had made all of them the same way. The machine was still running, but the design was gone. The discharge document was a small thing. A wooden tablet, or in the case of auxiliary veterans, a pair of bronze plates, inscribed with a man's name, his unit, his years of service, and a formal statement that he had served with honor. He carried it with him for the rest of his life. In a world without a centralized identity infrastructure, where a man's legal status depended entirely on what he could prove to the satisfaction of a local magistrate, the diploma was the most important object he owned. It was proof that the machine had released him on good terms, and that proof had weight wherever Roman law reached, which, by the height of the empire, was almost everywhere. The honesta missio, the honorable discharge, came with a ceremony, though not an elaborate one. The man's name was read aloud. His service was confirmed before witnesses. He received his premia, the cash settlement that represented 25 years of deferred reward. For an auxiliary soldier who had not been a citizen when he enlisted, the diploma also granted him Roman citizenship, a legal transformation that changed his status, his children's status, and the legal standing of the woman he had been living with for years in the vicus outside the fort. He walked in a non-citizen. He walked out Roman. The empire had absorbed him completely, and then, as its final act, certified the absorption in bronze. What he did next depended on who he was and where he had served. Some went home, back to the province they had come from, to whatever family remained and whatever land or trade they could piece together from their savings. But a striking number did not go home. Men who had spent 25 years stationed at a fort on the Rhine or the Danube or the edge of the Sahara found that the settlement outside the fort, the vicus, the small civilian town that had grown up around the military presence, had become more familiar than anywhere they had ever lived before. The family they had made there, the woman and the children, the local traders they had dealt with for years, the tavern keeper who knew their name, all of it was there. And home was a province they had left when they were barely men and barely remembered with any warmth. Many veterans settled close to where they had served, and Rome eventually formalized and encouraged this tendency. Veteran colonies, coloniae, were planted across the empire, some of them at the sites of old military installations, nor others at new locations chosen for strategic or economic reasons. The colony was not simply a reward mechanism. It was a continuation of the military system by other means. A community of veterans at the edge of a newly conquered territory was a community of men trained to fight, accustomed to hardship, loyal to Roman order, and invested in the stability of the ground beneath their feet. They were garrisoned where they had been sent, without it costing Rome the expense of garrisoning them. Augustus settled somewhere around 300,000 veterans in colonies during his reign alone. The figure is staggering even by the standards of an empire accustomed to thinking in large numbers. He recorded it himself with evident satisfaction in the Res Gestae, the account of his achievements inscribed outside his mausoleum, noting colonies in Africa, in Sicily, Macedonia, both Spain's, Achaia, Asia, Syria, Narbonese Gaul, Pisidia, and 28 sites in Italy. Each one was a community built from the same raw material the legions had been built from. Men shaped by the same system, speaking the same language of order and structure and Roman expectation, transplanted into the provinces to take root and hold the ground. The colonies were built the way the army built everything, to a plan laid out with precision, structured for function. The grid streets of a veteran colony replicated the grid streets of the military camp. The forum sat where the Principia had sat in the fort, the administrative center, the place where authority made itself visible, where the main thoroughfares followed the same logic as the Via Principalis and the Via Praetoria that every soldier had learned to navigate in his first weeks of service. A veteran arriving in a new colony for the first time found the layout already familiar, because it was drawn from the same template as every camp he had ever built and struck and rebuilt across 25 years of service. The army's spatial logic had followed him into retirement. Timgad, in what is now northeastern Algeria, is the version of this that time preserved most completely. Emperor Trajan founded it around 100 CE for veterans of the 3rd Augustan Legion, men who had spent their service on the North African frontier, guarding the edge of the empire against the Berber peoples of the Ores Mountains. It was built at the intersection of 6 roads, aimed on a grid of perfect orthogonal precision inside a square perimeter wall with 4 gates. Within the walls, there was a forum, a theater, 4 bathhouses, a basilica, a library, markets, temples to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and residential plots of equal size, 20 meters by 20 meters, laid out for men of equal legal standing who had come out the other side of the same machine. The library alone held an estimated 3,000 scrolls. Most of the men it was built for had probably never owned a book in their lives before the legion gave them one. The colony at Cologne, Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, began differently, growing from a settlement of veterans of the Rhine campaigns under the Emperor Claudius in the 1st century CE. It became the administrative capital of the province of Lower Germania and the largest Roman city north of the Alps. Beirut, Berytus in the Roman period, was settled by veterans of 2 Italian legions and became the foremost center of Roman legal scholarship in the Eastern Empire, its school of law producing jurists whose work formed the backbone of the Justinianic Code compiled centuries later. The veterans who settled there were not lawyers. Their children were not lawyers, but they had brought Roman legal culture into a city, and the city had grown around it, and the lawyers came from what that culture produced. Lyon, Lugdunum, was founded in 43 BCE by the Roman general Lucius Munatius Plancus at the confluence of the Rhone and Saône rivers, on a site that had held a settlement of Gauls displaced by Caesar's campaigns. It became the capital of Roman Gaul, the seat of the imperial mint, and one of the largest cities in the Western Empire. It sat on trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Rhine frontier, and its growth was sustained by the economic activity that veteran settlement anchored and civilian commerce subsequently built upon. It remained a major city through the collapse of the Western Empire and the medieval period that followed, and it remains one today. The veterans who first settled its streets are dust. The city they seeded is alive. The cultural transmission the veterans carried was not abstract. It was embedded in the specific practices of daily life. The way a man organized a household, the language he spoke in the forum and taught his children, the gods he built temples to, the legal framework he used to settle disputes over land and inheritance, the expectation that public life should include baths and theaters and spaces for civic assembly. These were not values the veteran had absorbed from philosophical instruction. They were habits the army had installed in him over 25 years of structured daily life, practices so repeated and so normalized that they no longer felt like Roman culture. They felt like the correct way to do things. When he settled in a colony and his children grew up inside the practices he had carried out of the legion, they grew up Roman without being told they were becoming Roman. The sons of veterans served in the legions at high rates. This was not incidental. A man who had grown up in a veteran colony had grown up hearing the language of military service, now watching his father maintain the habits of a soldier, living in a community whose social structure and physical layout both derived from the military template. When the recruiting officers came through, he was predisposed to enlist in a way that the son of a farmer in a remote province was not. By the 3rd century CE, the legions stationed in the frontier provinces were drawing much of their manpower from exactly these communities. The sons and grandsons of veterans, born and raised in the shadow of the forts their fathers had helped to garrison. Voluntary hereditary service, in practice, preceded the legal compulsory version that the 3rd century would eventually formalize. The auxiliary soldier who completed his service received something the legionary had been born with and perhaps taken for granted: Roman citizenship. His diploma confirmed it, his children inherited it, and in the provinces where auxiliary units were most concentrated, the Rhine, the Danube, Britain, North Africa, the citizenship grants accumulated over generations into communities of provincials who were, legally and culturally, Romans. Hadrian's Wall in Britain is the most visible remnant of this process. A military frontier that generated a civilian hinterland of trading towns, veteran settlements, and mixed communities whose inhabitants thought of themselves as Roman because the army had given their grandparents a piece of bronze that said they were. The road was the other legacy, and it was everywhere. And the legions built roads not primarily for civilian traffic, but for military movement, so that an army could march from one end of a province to the other without losing time to flooded tracks and broken terrain. But a road built for a legion served a merchant equally well, and served a messenger, and served a provincial governor, and served the slow accumulation of trade and interaction that connected the parts of the empire to each other. The roads outlasted the legions that built them by centuries. Some outlasted the empire itself, becoming the foundations of medieval roots, and in a few cases, the foundations of modern ones. The men who dug and surfaced and maintained them had done so as a military obligation. The world they built for commerce and communication and cultural exchange was, from their point of view, a side effect. The Roman military system was, in the end, a machine for the manufacture of a specific kind of human being. It took landless men, men with nothing and no prospects, and built from them soldiers of documented and reliable capability. But the manufacture did not end at discharge. The man who came out of the machine carried the machine inside him. In his posture, his habits, his spatial expectations, his language, his gods, his understanding of what order looked like and what it was worth. When he settled in a colony and raised children and built a house on a grid street next to a forum with a temple to the Capitoline Triad, he was not consciously transmitting Roman culture. He was simply living the way he knew how to live. The transmission was automatic. That was the design. Rome's enemies, over 1,000 years of Western dominance, were frequently braver than Rome's soldiers. Some were stronger. Many were fighting for something more personal and more immediate. Their own ground, their own people, a rage that no institution had manufactured and no pay scale had purchased. What they almost never had was a system that could take the raw human material of an empire and produce from it, generation after generation, the same reliable product. The Gaul who fought Caesar's legions was terrifying and individually formidable and militarily no match for what faced him. The German tribesman who destroyed Varus's 3 legions was a tactician of genius operating in his own terrain, and he had been trained by the very army he defeated. Neither produced something that lasted in the way Rome's system lasted, because neither had a system. They had warriors. Rome had a machine. What the machine left behind was not only cities and roads and legal codes, though it left all of those. It left a template for how an institution could take ordinary human beings and, through sustained systematic effort, transform them into something more durable and more capable than they had been before, and then release them into the world to transmit that transformation to everyone around them. Every army that has tried to build a professional standing force since Rome has, knowingly or not, been working from variations of the same design, standardized training, collective unit identity, a career structure with clear incentives, and the subordination of individual instinct to collective reflex. The Roman army did not invent all of these things in finished form, but it refined them over 1,000 years of operational feedback, in wars on 3 continents against every variety of human opposition, and it produced something that has never quite been surpassed as a proof of concept. The man who walked out of the fort on discharge day was in his 40s. He was tired in ways that had become structural, written into the joints, the back, the places where old injuries had healed badly or not at all. He had the diploma in his pack and the premia in his purse, and a face that most civilians, on a road somewhere between the fort and wherever he was going, would read immediately as a soldier's face, even in civilian clothes. He would live the rest of his life in a community of men who looked the same way, who had the same face, who rose at the same hour from habit and ate plain food, and kept their possessions organized in the manner of men who had spent 25 years knowing that everything they owned might need to be packed and carried before dawn. He was free. He had been free, technically, for his whole service. A paid volunteer, not a conscript, not a slave. He had never quite felt it, and he did not quite feel it now. Somewhere in the provinces, in a city that had started as a grid of leather tents and become a grid of stone streets, a young man, not yet grown into his name, was looking at the veterans in the forum the way young men had been looking at veterans for centuries. He was watching the way they stood. He was listening to the stories that filtered through the tavern walls, distorted and enlarged by time and wine into something barely recognizable as the grinding, muddy, cold reality of service. He was calculating, in the way that the landless and the surplus and the youngest sons always calculated, whether 25 years of that life might produce something better than the alternative. The recruiting officers would be in town before spring. The machine was still running. It was already looking for him.